All right. There's some chairs up in the front if people want a seat. I'm so tall. Everyone? Okay. Hello. I feel like this is I'm very short.
Recording in progress.
Okay. All right, if everyone can take their seats, that would be great. Welcome to NYU. I'm Sarah Kramer. I'm an audio journalism professor here. So thank you for spending your Friday nights with us. Feel free to grab food and drink. Just some housekeeping. Bathrooms are past to the right of the elevators over there. And turn off your phones if you haven't already. So happy to have you all here. We're going to get started. Okay. If it bleeds, it leads. As we in the audio field know all too well from the rise of true crime podcasts, sensationalized coverage of crime and policing dominates the charts. But when did this symbiotic relationship between press, police, and crime begin? In the new podcast, Empire City, Chenjerai Kumanyika digs into the origin story of the world's largest police force, the NYPD. And the role of media is a big part of that story. So Chenjerai, who I'm honored to have as a colleague here at NYU, kind of specializes in challenging mainstream narratives of American history. Some of you may know his previous work, like Uncivil, the Peabody Award-winning podcast series he made about stories that were left out of the official history of the Civil War. One of my favorite podcasts ever. To Seeing White, the series that investigated the notion of whiteness itself. And now with Empire City. Chenjerai continues to force us to grapple with the often ugly truth behind the stories that America tells about itself. In Empire City, we hear how the NYPD operated as a northern slave patrol, kidnapping free black people and sending them back to slavery. We hear how the NYPD cracked down on sex workers, on immigrants, and how it lobbied for more powerful weapons. We also hear how ordinary New Yorkers resisted the NYPD's power from the beginning. The history of the NYPD is fascinating, but I do have to say as an audio producer, it's not a natural subject for a podcast. All of the main characters died over 100 years ago. There's no archival audio, so pretty challenging. But Chenjerai, along with Empire City's story editor and executive producer Diane Hudson, who we have here on stage, worked with a really talented team of producers and sound designers to make the history come alive and feel very resonant to today. So tonight we'll hear how they did it. We'll also hear from Asad Dandia, a public historian, organizer, and tour guide who's a character in Empire City. And we'll talk about how journalists who cover crime and the NYPD can do better, how to report fairly and accurately, rather than writing sensational headlines that perpetuate stereotypes. Our event is co-sponsored by the Ethics and Journalism Initiative here at NYU, and I'm very thankful to Ryan Housel of EJI for moderating the discussion tonight. And I'm sure there are going to be a lot of questions, and we're going to have space for Q&A at the end. Thank you.
And Yola, let me ask you a question. What do you think the police do?
They keep people safe.
I'm Chenjerai Kumanyika, and this is Empire City, the untold origin story of the NYPD. At a time when we're debating where policing is going, we're going to tell you where the police came from.
The first person to use the term organized crime, he didn't mean it in the sense of Don Corleone and the mafia. He meant it in terms of the police department.
Welcome, everybody. I'm Ryan Housel from the Ethics and Journalism Initiative at NYU, and we're so glad to have you this evening, and we're so thankful to Chenjerai and Diane for being here to talk a little bit more about Empire City and what we can learn from the past about how to do better in the present. As you can see, this podcast it's a really ambitious project. If you listen to it, it covers multiple centuries, it moves across multiple continents. But Chenjerai, we see in the first episode that it begins with a really kind of personal story. And so I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what inspired you to look into this history and to start creating this podcast on this topic.
All right, thank you so much. Now listen, I promised these people who helped me put on this event that I would be disciplined and not just ramble on. And so I promise to stick to that, but I do just have to take a minute to just thank a bunch of folks. One of the things about podcasting that's very deceptive is that you hear my voice for too long, any of you who have listened, and we function under the illusion that this was all me, but it was not. Podcasting, and I would say journalism, is a deeply collaborative effort. In fact, I think that we have innovated in the way that we use collaboration. And so part of my excitement of having this event is to thank the people that really made this and sort of pull back the curtains on that and thank the people that really made this possible. There's so many people. I probably should thank, first of all, my team. And, Diane is I think is the person more so than anyone else who without, this would not have been possible. And I'm actually going to do I'm going to actually take sort of Mike Bully producer privilege here and invite Sam Riddell. Sam, I hate to put you on the spot, but could you please take this seat if you feel comfortable? Because Sam produced one of the episodes we're going to talk about.
Love the shirt, Sam.
Now, Sam, we got a script sort of, but you know what I mean. Thank you. And to the whole team, folks who couldn't be here, and also this event, I got to just take a minute to thank everybody. Sarah Kramer and Ryan really got in there and made sure that I'm not just sort of like rambling and playing random audio clips. I want to thank Maria Roberts, who is our events person. I got to give a big shout out to Ellen Horn, who sort of initiated and has spearheaded the podcast and audio reportage. Come on, give a big hand for that. You know what I'm saying? That's why we up in here, y'all. Like, this is official. You know what I'm saying? Like, this is actually a part of the Academy because of Ellen's leadership. And Rob Boynton and other people. There's so many people to thank. I'm sure I'm forgetting someone, but my students and the students who helped, people you saw at the door, everybody, thank you. All right, now to your question.
And Sam, welcome to the stage. Any questions that I bring up, please chime in as we talk about, the story editing process and the producing process and how you kind of conceptualized of this series. So Chenjerai, I'm going to pull you back to that first question.
Yes.
Tell me about, what inspired you to dig into this history?
Well, certainly growing up as a black man in America, my experiences with police were mostly not the greatest. And so I think it gave me a kind of skepticism about police from the gate and a skepticism about even the law, right? And so I grew up with that. But my questions about policing sharpened in the last decade. We've just experienced what could be called like the Black Lives Matter decade, right, in a way, right, bracketing out the problems there. But, and in that decade, right, it just felt like we're inundated with stories about police, right? Mm-hmm. Like, every time you turn on, to the point where, sadly, even when you hear the names of people who've been killed by the police, people's eyes start to glaze over because it's just an endless, you can't even remember the videos, and it's what, and so I thought I really understood police, but at a certain moment, one of the things I began to wonder was, where did the police actually start? Where did this institution start? And I got to shout out my wife, just came in. Speaking of people you got to thank, Sadaka Kumanika. Sorry to put you on blast, babe, but y'all already know what it is. And I started to ask around, like some people, I would say, I know everybody knows a lot about police. We have problems. I said, where did the first 4 or 5 police departments start? Mm. And no one could answer. And I thought that was fascinating since there's like over 18,000 police departments in this country. And so that was, those questions were percolating in my mind. And then someone sent me a video which really blew things open for me. It was a video of my father. And, I'll just start out by saying, my father died in 1993. And, he was, I was really close with my father, and I never saw a moving image of him, because in 1993, you didn't have Instagram and TikTok. Not that I know how to use TikTok, I sort of still don't. But the point is, I probably, you don't, you can't, it wasn't easy to get moving images of people. And I often thought that might be comforting. Yeah. And then someone sent me this video, and I did see my father. I don't know if we have the video to play it. You'll see my father. It's a real quick clip, but you'll see him. He looks like there he is. See, he looks like a slimmer, more fit, handsome version of me. And I'm watching this, right? And I'm like, wow. My first reaction is just, there's my dad. I'm like freezing on him, right? I'm not even paying attention to the context. But, the context was that these were activists with the Congress of Racial Equality who were handcuffed inside a police precinct in New York. And this is surveillance footage shot by the NYPD. And so I had these really complex emotions, which were this really, like, I'm connecting to my dad, right? I almost wanted to just cry and touch him. And at the same time, I'm like, the only reason this exists is because somehow thousands of dollars were funneled, taxpayer dollars were funneled into something to surveil people who were protesting an incident of police brutality, right? And the kinds of things that CORE was protesting, CORE, my father marched with Martin Luther King and people like that. The kinds of things that they were protesting are the things that I think, people widely agree are part of what makes America at least have a shot at being a democracy. And so I was like, how could this institution of the police have actually, just funded and developed the whole institution that did this? And I just want to make one brief clarification before we move on, that so much of what I had seen in the sort of Black Lives Matter decades were incidents of like police brutality or killing, right? Where police actually became very good at saying, well, the person deserved it, or this was a bad training, or whatever. But this is different. This is not bad training. This is a whole unit dedicated to surveilling these people and provoking them. So that became a jump-off point for me to say, what is this institution really, right, that could do something like that?
Absolutely, and I mean, what we see over the course of the many episodes is that, surveillance programs like this, or programs that target specific identity groups, it's not an anomaly at all. It's really foundational to how the police developed over the, couple of hundred years that we're looking at. And Diane, I guess my next question is for you. We start in the 19th century, as Sarah mentioned, it's an interesting time to start because there's not a ton of archival footage. I think that people mostly think of that history as somewhat dry. And I was just wondering, as you're, as a story editor and executive producer, conceptualizing how this story translates into a multi-part series, how did you decide that that was where the story kind of began?
It took a little while to get to this place, but I would say we were initially envisioned this as one episode, and we realized there was a lot more to it. And when we envisioned it as one episode, we were thinking about what you hear in kind of these first two episodes. You hear about the kidnapping clubs happening and what's going on with the Black community, the way that they're being targeted in New York City at this time, while at the same time, kind of across town, you have these murders of white women that the press are jumping on because that's going to get people to pay attention, that's going to get people to buy the papers. And so the press is paying attention to this one idea of like crime over here and completely ignoring what is happening, the harm that's being created in the Black community. And it's these two things happening next to each other and where the attention was being put and how the police figured into these two things. And for those of you that don't know the Kidnapping Club, those that were doing the kidnapping were the police. So if you haven't yet listened. And so you have this tension of like the police are going to try and solve the crimes of the white women's murders while at the same time are going and kidnapping folks in the Black community. And so it was important to think about this, not separating it out, but what can we learn by like pulling these ideas together? But at the same time, thinking about it like this is the 19th century. This is really hard. So what can we do to bring it to life? And a big part of that was obviously leaning on really intelligent, thoughtful historians, but finding characters whose stories we could really like have you hold on to and feel connected to in this history, as well as like pull toward the present. And connect to people like Mariam Kaba you hear in these first two episodes who so embody what we're talking about in this history. Because one of the things that became very clear to us at the beginning of this process is not a lot's changed. And so almost like kind of all these themes and the topics that we're talking about in each of these episodes, they feel really, really relevant to us today. And so we really kind of made it a point whenever possible to kind of uplift those connections. Assad's here with us today. And yeah, so that's what we tried to do and what we're trying to tackle.
Could I just quickly say, you know, a big part of that was like having to do research. I did a little bit of research in the 4 years leading up. But when it came to really nailing down to tell this story, Sam really we gave Sam like impossible, like Mission Impossible historical tasks. We're like, all right, here's what we need. You know, a person in the 19th century who blank, 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 blank. And so, Sam, could you say a little bit about what that felt like to be in that?
Yeah, we'd love to hear.
Bind, like.
It was really hard. I would say this is like the most difficult and ambitious project that I've ever worked on, and like the most narrative documentary style project that I've ever worked on. So the additional task of like tell an audio story where everyone's dead and most of the people who are associated with this don't want to talk to you because they are police and things like that was very difficult. But I did start to find like a sick sort of like fun in going through newspaper archives at late night and stuff like that. So yeah, but it was very challenging.
And I'm glad you said newspaper archives. Watch what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna bring us right back on track. So it's like this. So it's like
I was gonna do it if you didn't.
Yeah, exactly. So even researching my father's story, right? The newspaper winds up being a tremendous. Any historian knows the newspaper's a tremendous, probably like your best friend in terms of trying to jump back into the 19th century, right? But what we really discovered was that, there was more going on with the media. And let me just say, I was a little bit in the weeds when it came to this, right? I got into these newspapers. I'm looking at like city council meetings, and I would come out, you're trying to make this compelling, right? That was the demand. So I would come to Diane, right, and Sam, and I'd be like, yo, there was this city council meeting where this one dude was like, yo, police, blah, blah, blah. And they were like, change, that ain't it. That is not it, chief. So I was way in the weeds. And it was really, I think, Diane who first was like, I think there's a moment in all of this that we can lift up to really push things forward. And so it sort of started with basically, weirdly, like a cigar shop.
So the year is 1841, and there was this young woman named Mary Rogers, a very lovely young woman who worked at a tobacco shop, a cigar store over there, actually. It was where the cigar shop is, believe it or not.
Greg Young hosts the Bowery Boys podcast, and he's an expert on old New York. Greg and I are standing next to a Gilded Age fountain in City Hall Park, right across the street from Mary's tobacco shop.
Everyone is smoking. Everyone from City Hall, all of the politicians.
And this woman, Mary, she's the plug. She sells them good tobacco and chats them up.
She's actually kind of a local celebrity, both for her beauty, but also like, it seems like she had good rapport, she had an interesting personality.
One day, in the summer of 1841, Mary's lifeless body is found floating in the Hudson River. So just imagine you're living in 19th century New York and you're hearing about this murder. But who's gonna solve it?
And so, you just think like, okay, yeah, you'd like to find out who did this, right? It's scary to murder. It's important. Someone's life has been taken. If this was today, you have all these like detectives, right? And forensic science, right? And all these kinds of things that you can use to try to begin to figure this out, even though maybe we could talk about the NYPD's clearance rate later, but but back then you didn't have any of that, right? The police were far too busy doing things like kidnapping free black people to really have developed a science of solving crimes. But what we found out was that there were institutions who were driving, and raising some questions about this and pushing that kind of project forward.
And what you'll see is that at this time, as Chenjerai mentioned, the police are functioning in a completely different way, but you have these voices calling for an institution that looks a little bit more like what we're familiar with. And as Diane was saying, we're getting disproportionate attention on some stories versus others. And so we have a clip that shows a little bit about what happened in the press following the murder of Mary Rogers.
Bennett is a legend in media. And if you think papers like the New York Times or the Washington Post are influential today, they have nothing on the sheer power of the New York Herald in its earliest years. This is before radio or TV. Politicians can't speak directly to the public, but Bennett can, and he's using his reach to set the political agenda. So when Mary Rogers is murdered, Bennett starts talking a lot of smack about New York's dusty, disorganized police.
He used the difficulty in solving the case to denounce police incompetence and the moral disintegration of the city.
Bennett watches what the police are doing, and then he tells his readers, hey y'all, the police don't have the answers. He calls the Watchmen sleepy guardians of the night, and he points out that they didn't collect any intel on the case. He complains that the police are too slow, then floats his theory about the murder without any real evidence.
It's almost like Tucker Carlson, where he doesn't say it, he suggests it.
And yeah, and so I'm, from a media standpoint, I just, what I didn't really grasp and what was revelatory to me, and what, Diane and Sam's research really helped to lift up even more was that, like obviously an institution like the New York Times, the Amsterdam News, the Daily, are really important, right? And they're obviously influential, right? But like back in the 19th century, this is on a whole nother level because today those institutions compete with television, social media, right? Politicians can just go straight to the people, right? Some politicians have their own media outlets. Then you didn't have any of that, right? What you had was newspapers. So if a politician wants to speak to America, they kind of got to go through the newspaper. So newspapers had an inordinate influence, right? And they wielded far more power, and this had real implications, I think, for media ethics.
Yeah, and I mean, what we're seeing here is, early New York local crime reporting, which I know many people in this, audience are really familiar with. Maybe they're doing crime reporting themselves. And what you're seeing is a specific agenda or like specific assumptions, specific objectives of this type of reporting. And so I was wondering if you could just dig a little bit more into what reporting on crime looked like. We got a little teaser in that clip, but kind of what assumptions they were operating under, and also what were the consequences of the type of reporting that Bennett and the New York Herald were doing. What I think we're going to hear is, about some pretty unethical practices or, some goals beyond just telling the truth and reporting fairly and accurately.
My not be a horrible man rules tells me that I need to not say anything next.
I could speak to that.
Yeah.
I could speak to that. I think that one thing that I learned that was really important during producing this episode was that the goal, well, it's the same goal today, right? But the goal of these papers was to sell. Mm-hmm. So, like you don't have people. What am I trying to say? Sorry, I didn't expect to be up here, guys.
No, you're doing great.
Thank you. But yeah, you don't have like color printing and stuff like that. So you need to like really make the headlines very grabby. And something that I learned that totally didn't make it to any of these episodes is that the first ever police chief, George Matsell, went on to produce like a newspaper. I forget what it's called.
The Police Gazette.
The Police Gazette, yeah. And
which still exists, sort of.
Yeah, in a really weird way, and that's a whole other tangent. But it's
a tabloid, just to be clear.
Yeah, it's a tabloid. So the front pages of those papers were filled with just like the most gruesome crimes that you could imagine. So like the point was really to use crime as a means to sell the papers.
And also something that you mentioned, Diane, a little bit earlier is that they're focusing on a specific type of crime. They're focusing on specific victims. And I was wondering if you could dig a little bit more into that and like who is left out and how are they describing this crime and these victims?
I think like the Tucker Carlson reference is very accurate that we just heard because it was a lot of. Because there wasn't the detective work that Chenjerai mentioned, instead it was like, well, we have to sell papers tomorrow. What like crazy cockamamie theory can we come up with and put in today's news? And that just like kept going because you needed, like you think about like real estate today, like ever since the 24/7 news cycle, you need to like fill up our time. So with the papers, it's like if we want people, we're like getting them excited by the Rogers murder, like we got to keep them in. And so it was tantalizing that, like, how do you take as long as possible to like fill up as much real estate on the page, get people in, and that's what they did. So it was like they had an economic, as Chandra says in the show, but like they had an economic incentive in crime because it helped them sell the papers. And so they just played all of it up.
You know, there's 2 points I want to make here is that thinking about the role of these papers in relation to the police, you know, one of the things that shocked all of us was how much New Yorkers did not necessarily want police, right? They had a kind of police force, right? They had constables at the point when we start, but people really didn't want an organized police force, right? You know, and it was like, you know, I mean, things were happening, and some of the reason why was because we weren't that far out from the Revolutionary War. There were still people who had lived through the Revolutionary War. One of the things we found out that is interesting and didn't make the show is that there is a monument to the Revolutionary War here in New York where American revolutionaries were sort of imprisoned, right, here. And it was kind of put up to remind people, like, if you have uniformed people occupying our land, it can go against democracy. So people were alive who lived through that. Their family members had been in that prison. And, you know, what I think Diane and Sam really helped me to see in the narrative was how this moment about this Mary Rogers murder changed that. The second thing I want to say is that it's easy to kind of, you know, James Gordon Bennett, who's a legend in media, by the way, it's big James Gordon Bennett Herald statue in Times Square and so forth. You know, he himself was like a penny press pioneer, tabloid. It's easy to sort of sit back and critique him like, oh, they were so stupid and naive and unethical back then. But what we found was kind of like a lot of the priorities at the press are things that I think we can implicate ourselves in today, right? This word crime, right? Which is a category that, you know, might have at that point was like could be like black people reading depending on where you lived, as opposed to focusing on harm. So I think that you know, that's I think in some ways the space to be in when you look at this is to sort of, it's fine I think to laugh at this and to look at these people and distance themselves and realize how wicked it is, but the real project I think for us is to look at the lines of continuity.
And I think, you know, that thing that you bring up about how crime is defined in really different ways by different people, and then that influences what they cover in crime reporting really comes out when you look at an alternative press, which is the black press and the abolitionist press that was functioning at this time and, you know, contesting these media narratives. And so, go ahead.
I should probably set it up a little bit.
Yeah, you want to set it up a little bit.
So, yeah, I mean, as Ryan is saying, you know, there's always in American history another kind of press functioning, right? Run by people who don't have I would argue the other press is objective in the sense that they're dealing with empirical facts, right? Like the empirical fact of slavery. But they're dealing with those empirical facts with an agenda, which is to end slavery. And one of the iconic figures in this role in New York is a man named David Ruggles. And Ruggles, when I learned about him, I was like, yo, this dude is like he's like the protagonist, he's a hero, but like heroes are kind of corny, let's be honest, right? So he's almost like the coolest villain hero, right? Like he's a dude who when he shows up on the screen, you get, you know, white folks get scared. Let's be clear, 19th century white folks, right? Because he's smart, he's smarter than them, and he's not scared. And actually, but one of his most potent weapons is, well, we'll see. Yeah.
Ruggles was constantly writing in black newspapers. He published his own periodical called The Mirror of Liberty. And in the pages of the most widely circulated abolitionist newspaper, The Liberator, he spoke truth to power.
The most extraordinary samples of human depravity that have disgraced our city were police officers and judges.
Ruggles writes a warning.
Colored people, beware. A certain constable in this city is very active in entering the dwellings of colored people, pretending to have search warrants and ransacking their houses from cellar to garret in search of fugitives from slavery.
He says, don't let anybody in your house unless you know for sure they're your friends. And he coins a term for Boudinot and his gang.
The Kidnapping Club.
So, I'm sorry, I got to make a humorous aside. We were really trying to get our fact checking 100% right, because we knew when you have a show like this, people would come at you. And that meant like up to the last minute, we were like in these old newspapers, and like Sam a lot of times was the person who had the receipts. So I remember one time, like late into the show, Sam is now pretty much done with the role of the show. What time was it when I hit you? It was like 9 p.m.?
It was noon, but it was a Sunday.
That's even worse.
And I was watching a Tubi movie. So I was so divorced from this world.
And me, Diane and I, we were like trying to work this out. We were like, we got to call Sam. I hate to do it. I haven't texted Sam, and it was like about some question that you can only find like deep in some archive too. This wasn't like an easy question. This was like a archival research question on the Sunday. Sam delivered. 10 minutes later, it's like, blop, here's your answer. Anyway, I just wanted to say that. But so it was real in New York. And just to be clear for people who haven't listened to the series, what you'll hear is that what was going on was that, you had slave owners in the South who were claiming that free black people were their property. In some cases, the free black people they were claiming were people who had escaped. In other cases, they weren't. They just was free black folks. And the police were cooperating using certain clauses in the American Constitution which permitted this to kidnap them for profit. And the police were involved. So what danger looked like if you were a black person was not simply something like the murder of Mary Rogers, which was important, but like I think about Henry Scott, who we didn't tell his story in the show, but he was a black child who went to a black school in New York, and when his parents were expecting him to come home from school, he did not, because during the school day, a police officer and a person, sort of claiming that Henry Scott was his property, came into the school, snatched him out of school, and sold Henry Scott into slavery, or tried to sell him into slavery. So he was kidnapped. He was locked up in jail. So that's what danger looked like for the black community.
Yeah. And I think just from a story editing perspective, it's really interesting the way we received this. In episode 2, we get these parallel stories of Bennett and Ruggles, and these two very different histories of the press. I think a lot of times, like the black press is left out of like traditional histories of the press and of newspapers. And so I was just wondering, from a producing and an editing perspective, why was it important for you to tell both those stories together in parallel? And like, what did you feel like, what different truths did that bring out by telling those stories in parallel?
Well, I think like it's easy to look at the one. I mean, one of the things, like an operating principle of the show, we're thinking of it as like a people's history. Mm-hmm. So from kind of baked in from the beginning, it was wanting to make sure we didn't just share a dominant narrative. The tricky part, unlike Uncivil, is like nobody knows the dominant narrative of the police. So like one of the things we came into the show knowing is that everybody has feelings. You all have feelings about the police. I don't know what they are. I could guess what they are if you're in the room. But like, I don't know what they are. But like everybody has a feeling about the police. Very, very few people know how we got to this point, right? And that became this thing that it was challenging because people think they know, but it's based pretty much on nothing. And so we had to both show, like in this show, like the dominant narrative, what was being said, and also simultaneously subvert that. And so part of it was we couldn't just be showing what is being said in the black press, because you needed to see it in conversation with the dominant narrative so that we could have a piece that like lived just outside the fringes, but could be something that could be both a narrative history that speaks like across, like both, for everybody, essentially, like to look at something that's like lifting up the history in a way that ideally, to the best of our ability, I mean, no one can ever do anything perfectly, but as much as possible, lifting up the voices that don't normally get lifted up and centering that in our reporting, and then like everything else is built around that versus doing the flip, which is often the case in these kind of historical pieces.
Yeah.
I also think it was important to like not lean into the narrative of like trauma porn, for lack of a better term. Like, obviously, when you dig into these kinds of histories, you're going to find a lot of effed up stuff that happened to black people. And so it was important to go into the newspapers and kind of talk about the resistance efforts that were happening during this time, and conversation with what the police were doing.
And I'd say like resistance, but also the way in which resistance is a form of safety, right? Like in a way to provide safety in that community. And that's how we heard about that. Whereas like in the white community, it's like safety, like the press is pushing this narrative about like, what do we want to do about the police? Do we want to formalize them? What can this be? But in the black community, safety meant like you had to do it for yourself. And I think that's something that like resistance feels like. I feel like when people hear it, it's like pushing against something instead of like understanding it as always as a form of protection.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's like there are these, as you're saying, this people's history, there are multiple narratives and lineages that are being set forth all at once, and I feel like this episode and the series as a whole really brings that out. Of course, there's always this feeling as you move through history that you want people to be like learning from their mistakes and getting better. You want this idea that like, okay, the press, like, they were doing all of this stuff that was really bad, but then they realized, but I think, what you see in later episodes is that this idea of danger and criminality is leveraged against groups beyond black people. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that, Chenjerai, and how basically the press specifically leveraged the language of like danger and crime towards different marginalized groups.
Absolutely. Great question. One of the reasons why I became fixated on the history of police is because in a way it's a unifier at a time when we're so divided over so many things. Because of course, targeting black folks who are not yet African Americans was an important, crucial shaping force of police and all the other aspects of American empire. But it was not only black people who were targeted, right? So what you see even in the same period as James Gordon Bennett is getting started, is that another group, if you look over to the neighborhood of 5 Points, it was called 5 Points, is that it's black folks and it's also Irish folks, right, who now are strongly identified with the police. But back then, they were just, all you got to do is go back to the papers and you'll see who is cast as dangerous, right, along racial terms, right? In some of the same ways they talk about black people, it's in the Irish blood. They just can't, they can't, they just love violence and they get riled up. And so immigrants, right, is the category that Irish folks fit into at that point. And immigration, I gotta go here. If you, there's an incredible scene in Gangs of New York. You ever watch this film? Where Bill the Butcher, this character, right, basically he's standing on the docks with this other dude, and they see some Irish folks coming in off the boat, immigrating, right? And the other dude he's with, I forget, he's a politician, says, "When I see these Irish, I see new Americans," right? And Bill the Butcher says, "I don't see new Americans." And then he uses a bunch of racial slurs to say what he does see. And he says, "I see people who will do the work for a nickel, that, and he uses a racial slur about black people that they'll do for a dime and that a white man would do for a quarter," right? And I think it's really important to recognize that these white ethnics were not yet white. They were in the category of immigrants. And so part of the institution of policing, I'm talking about Germans, Italians, and then eventually like Eastern European Jews, a lot of anti-Semitism, right? The police institution also forms against them, particularly because a lot of those European immigrants had experiences of labor organizing. So when they came here, they were bringing like the sort of strategies and the sensibility of resisting and bringing radical politics.
Right, and what we see is that that doesn't only make them a target of the police, it makes them a target of the press and the press's language around them. We have actually behind you, I don't know if you caught it.
Yeah.
This is a New York Times story from early 1900s, like early 20th century.
I would say late 18th.
Late 18th,
century.
okay, kind of turn of the century, identifying dangerous groups, basically, and again, using that language, that police language of criminality, of crime, of danger, and really amplifying that in the press to a really large audience, perhaps,
Exactly, and I just, I want to, open the mic, but I just want to say, like, look at the language. Think about the dominant election issues today. Think about what dominates New York politics, media coverage today, right? Back then, what this article is basically saying is that the people you should be worried about in New York are people who fit in 3 categories: immigrants, criminals, and radicals. And basically, they kind of say they're all the same thing. If you read this article really closely, right, in the New York Times, it's telling you, like, you know, these neighborhoods are like mysterious, but they're dangerous. They have anarchists in them. They talk about worrying about extreme Jews. This is the New York Times, right? You know, worrying about, you know, and you have to kind of go in. It says, it calls Italians the degenerate sons of the Caesars. And it says you have to invade these neighborhoods to really understand how dangerous they are. This is the Times reporting this. But just think about contemporary coverage, though, right? From both political parties. We won't go there yet. All right.
Yeah. I mean, we'll talk about it later, but there's a whole onslaught of coverage in the Post for the last 2 months using the exact same language to describe Jackson Heights, Queens. And you wouldn't think it's, you know, it wouldn't look out of place in this newspaper from 1900.
Exactly.
And so, I mean, one of the...
Well, yeah. Well, I was just going to say, I don't, you know, let me go ahead.
Oh, I was going to bring it to the present day.
Oh,
I was
yeah.
going to say,
I was going to say, so again, now going into like how the donuts get made, no pun intended, is like, how do you take this though, and again, make it something compelling for now, and also really draw out those contemporary connections? So our, you know, producer, Peter Bresnan, who could not make it, but he's our senior producer, crucial, shout out to Peter, crucial component of the show. Through our research, we started looking at stories that would really bring things into the present, and we found a really compelling story that had a lot of elements of this people's history. And so, yeah, and it involved a just amazing person and tour guide and historian named Asad Dandia.
Asad Dandia was standing in the parking lot of his local mosque after evening prayers when a friend came up to him. This friend was a fellow Muslim and an off-duty cop. He said they needed to talk.
And we reach his car, and he asks me if I have my phone on me. I'm like, yeah, I got my phone on me. And I give him my phone, and he takes his phone, and he rolls them both into a cloth. He opens his car trunk, and he throws the cloth in the trunk, shuts it, and says, I need to speak to you without these present.
Asad started getting nervous. His friend looked serious.
And he kind of looks both ways, and he says, there's no easy way for me to tell you this, but you're being watched. I said, what in the world are you talking about? He said, Asad, I just came back from the precinct. There's a file with your name and your photos in it. The police are trailing you as we speak.
Asad's heart started racing. Why would the police be following him? But he knew his friend wouldn't make this up.
This is coming from someone who's in it, right? You know, this is not just like your boy on the block, like, yo, I think that dude is a spy. No, this is someone who's in it and saying, like, I saw a binder with your name on it.
This officer told Asad, be careful, man. Whatever you're doing that's drawing the police's attention, stop doing it. Think about yourself. Think about your family.
I was terrified. I was legitimately scared. Who am I gonna talk to? I'm not gonna talk to my parents. My parents are gonna panic. I'm not gonna talk to the police because they're the ones who are perpetrating this. Who am I gonna talk to?
All Asad could do was grab his phone from the trunk of the car, head home, and hope this was all some kind of weird misunderstanding. And maybe if he just ignored it and kept living his life, it would all go away.
And as you saw on the poster, we have Asad Dandia in attendance, so we're going to welcome you up to the stage so we can talk a little bit more.
To the stage.
Thank you so much for being here with us, Asad. I mean, as you can tell from the media coverage that we just talked about in the New York Times, to, you know, broader discussions of police's criminalization of immigrant communities, it's unfortunately not a surprise that there are programs like this to, you know, surveil and vilify immigrant communities. And so, Asad, I would just love it if you could tell us a little bit more about the story that is teased in that clip, your experience that ultimately, you know, culminated in you suing the New York Police Department, spoiler, which is a pretty big punchline. So yeah, if you could just tell us a little bit more about your story and kind of what brought you to this world.
Well, first I gotta say, it's really weird to hear your own voice.
Yeah.
It's the most, I don't listen to my own speeches, but this one I had to. Thank you to Sarah for putting this together, Ryan, Chenjerai, Diane for having me up here. I'm a public historian by profession. I lead walking tours all over New York City. My literal day job is to educate people about New York City's history, about the people who made this town what it is, going back 400 years. It's a whole other thing to be featured as a historical figure and a historical character in the city of my birth. So I want to thank you, and if we can all just give another round of applause to the team for that honor. Once upon a time when I was an undergrad, and now I'm at the age where it feels like a very long time ago, I had co-founded a charity organization that was dedicated to serving and feeding the people in my neighborhood who were not getting government assistance, single mothers, undocumented folks. Just to give you some more like texture, I grew up in the type of New York City neighborhood where English is spoken not even as a second but as a third language. So people will speak to you in 2 other languages before they speak to you in English. Most of the folks are working class, and we knew that there were people in need, and our mosque would do its best to kind of support the people in my neighborhood, but it wasn't enough. And so we founded a charity organization. We called it Muslims Giving Back. We were very grounded in our faith. And literally what we would do, me and my friends, we're all 17, 18-year-olds, would each get like $10 into a proverbial hat from our allowances or whatever, and we'd go to, Whole Foods or Trader Joe's or wherever we wanted, wherever we could find groceries, and deliver these groceries to families that we knew needed help. We eventually became a 501c3, started advertising our work on Facebook, back when people used Facebook. And we blew up all over the city. We had volunteers, hundreds of volunteers at some point. And one young man in particular, in March of 2012, sends me a message on Facebook Messenger, and he says, "Hey man, I really love the work you're doing. I want to try to get involved in it. I come from a very troubled background. I got kicked out of school. I'm really struggling, and you're doing service work, you're grounded in faith." He was also of Muslim background. He was my age, we were 19. I said, "Yeah, why don't you come on down to my neighborhood and partake in our activities?" And so he joined us, and he started getting involved in our food deliveries, our pantries, and so on. About a month later in April is when I had this conversation that you just heard with a police officer from my local mosque, who was also kind of an older brother figure to me at the time, and he told me that exactly what you heard. I went back home, talked to my friends about it, and then a week later, there's some spoilers here, just FYI. A week later, somebody else from my neighborhood says they want to speak to me as well, but they want to speak to me in their basement, away from kind of the public view. He said, "Come to my basement, I got to talk to you." I go to his basement, we're chatting it up, and he says, "Look, bro, I know somebody who's training to be a detective with the NYPD, and he says that they've seen photos of us doing our charity work." I said, "Okay, what else did you hear?" He said, "Not only are they spying on us, but they have identified us as a code orange threat." I said, "What the hell do you mean code orange threat?" Well, the NYPD had threat levels that they used as a metric system. The lowest was green, then yellow, then orange, and then red. So red was like the worst. So we were code orange. And I was like, holy smokes, this is real. I've heard from 2 different sources who don't know each other that we're being tailed. And we had an event coming up that summer. You're into hip hop, so you might appreciate this. And we had an event in Brooklyn that summer. We invited a guy named Napoleon, who was part of Tupac's entourage. And after Tupac was assassinated, he had converted to Islam, and he's living out in Los Angeles. And we wanted to call him to Brooklyn to kind of hear his story, going from like this former like hip hop artist to a pious Muslim. And we said, let's have this event, and then let's see where the organization is. Do we want to stop the work that we're doing, or do we want to keep going? We had that event, Atlantic Avenue in Brooklyn. It was a huge success. We were on cloud 9. We raised thousands of dollars. We were like, you know what? We're not going to stop our work. We're doing good work. For more social context, this is the time of Occupy Wall Street. It's 2012, and the Arab Spring. And I'm a 19-year-old who's like developing my political consciousness with all of these kind of events taking place. And then in October of that year, I get the news. I'm coming back from a food delivery in Bed-Stuy. My friend tells me, can you check your phone for a quick second and check Facebook? And I open up Facebook, and the first thing I see, and the way it worked at that time in Facebook is that if you had a mutual friend that had like a viral post, it would show up on the top of your feed. So the first thing I see is a confession from that young man who had reached out to me earlier that year saying that he had a troubled past and he wanted to get involved. I was an informant sent by the NYPD to investigate terrorism. I'm coming out to confess. It was about a 2-paragraph long confession. In the confession, he had mentioned that there were others that he saw at our events that were also spying on us, and he's telling these others, you should also come out and confess. And he confesses, word gets out to the media. A couple weeks later, this organization called CUNY Clear gets in touch with me. If you do reporting on like racial profiling and discrimination, you should definitely know this organization. CLEAR stands for Creating Law Enforcement Accountability and Responsibility. They're based out at CUNY Law School. And I meet with them in their offices, and I tell them what happened to me. And then in a dramatic scene like out of a movie, the lawyers close the door, and they say, Assad, there's a reason why we called you here. For a couple of years, we've been working on this lawsuit to challenge police surveillance. And we are speaking to a number of undisclosed community members, we can't tell you their names, who have all been impacted the way you have similarly. And we're bringing you all together to eventually launch this case against the NYPD. So I felt like I was being recruited to the Avengers, right? They're like, we got all these Muslims who were screwed over by the cops, and we're bringing you all together to mount one big challenge against Thanos. I'm 19 years old, community college student. I've never talked to a lawyer in my life. I come from a working class neighborhood. I don't even know what this world is. I say, I need a moment. Like, can I step outside and think about it? Say, no, go back home, come back in 3 weeks. So I went back home, talking to my friends about it. They're like, are you fucking crazy? There's no way you're gonna do this. They're gonna
sue the NYPD.
Yeah, like you're gonna get in trouble. What's your mom gonna say? They're gonna retaliate. I had like homework and girls to think about, and here I am like, contemplating as to whether I should sue the world's largest and wealthiest police department. I come back in 3 weeks, and I meet a woman there in their office. Her name was Hina Shamsi. She introduced herself as the National Security Director of the ACLU. And she says, Assad, this is not just going to be a local case. You're going to have the full backing of the country's largest legal clinic, the ACLU. So I said, shit, sign me up. So I signed up. We officially filed the lawsuit in June of 2013. It lasted for basically my entire undergrad. We reached a settlement deal, and we'll go into some of the kind of the details about that in 2016, right before 45 was elected. He gets elected, and we are trying to beat the clock because we got a few policy changes, but the judge had not yet signed off on them, and we were afraid that if he were inaugurated in January that he could kind of either change the judge or something. And I kid you not, literally a few days before the inauguration, the judge signs off on our policy changes. That specific unit that was designated to spy on me was officially dismantled. That's not to say the surveillance is stopped, but that specific unit was dismantled. And yeah, I like to say I sued the NYPD and changed New York City policy before I got my first job.
Woo! I mean, what a story. What a story. I mean, and I'm sure many in this room and just many people are so grateful for the impact you made on the policy of the city. Something that I wanted to ask about is, you mentioned at the beginning of your story, you are like a storyteller by trade now, like as your profession. And so much of this conversation has been about how the stories we tell about crime and communities can't be separated from the way the police responds to these communities. And so I was really interested in your work. You run a program called New York Narratives, right, where you give tours and you talk about, stories that are not normally told of New Yorkers. And I think that, does really important work to kind of challenge these official media and police narratives that are put out about these communities. And I was just wondering, like, how you see that work as being kind of related to your experience, and how your community has been spoken about, and if there's other work you've been involved in or seen that you see kind of challenging those types of narratives.
Yeah, of course. So yeah, I operate my own walking tour company called New York Narratives. So it's a very easy name to remember. If you're on Instagram, that's the handle. And the walking tours that I focus on are stories of the city and the people that made the city that I felt for a very long time were not being told. Even on conversations related to policing in radical circles, right? Like my story, the stories of so many Muslims in New York, who comprise, by the way, 1 out of every 9 New Yorker. You know, from my vantage point, I was like, I'm uniquely situated to tell these stories, and I'm going to take advantage of the fact that I am a son of the city. I don't know any other place. And I'm going to tell these stories. I have been involved in other efforts. I work as a guide also at the Museum of the City of New York, and we had an exhibition go up about 2 years ago. It's down now, but you could still catch it online, called City of Faith, which talks about how faith communities made a place for themselves in New York. But the other thing that I want to talk about is the archival side of the work that I do, because y'all have been talking about archives, and I know we're in a room full of journalists. Look, Chenjerai, you said it best. The archives are your best friend, right? And you have to look for the hidden stories within the archives, right? Got to look in between the lines. You know, you're all journalists sitting in this room. Much of what you write will one day enter the archive, right? People are going to pour through your work, and they're gonna look at what you write on the surface, and they might say, okay, there are things that are missing here, right? There's a street corner that this person mentioned. What happened on that street corner, right? There are some names, right? Even with my court case, there was a whole lot of legalese I had to familiarize myself with. I feel like I should be given an honorary JD.
I agree.
Right?
I don't know who's in charge.
There was a lot of like legal jargon that I knew nothing about, and you know, I felt that even then, when reporters write about legal cases, that, you know, they want to get the legalese right for the fact-checking purposes, but it was also, I felt, important to see the face behind the case, right? That there's a story behind the legal papers that you're all reading through to write your articles and your reports, right? That what happened to me was a real thing. It's not something that was, it could have been a movie, and maybe one day it will be, but it was real, right? After we filed the lawsuit, the NYPD retaliated viciously, very viciously. I'll give you very quick examples. The day of the lawsuit, it was June 18th, 2013. It was a Tuesday morning. I gave a huge speech in front of One Police Plaza, which is the NYPD headquarters. A few hours later, my mother and my sister and I were on our way to the airport because we were going to go make pilgrimage to Mecca. And as soon as I gave that speech, and we're on our way to the airport, and the moment we reach the airport and the guy at the kiosk sees my name, he makes a very nervous smile, and he gives me back my boarding pass with quadruple S's on it. Has anyone ever gotten quadruple S's on their boarding pass? A couple of you, right? Okay, so I only saw 3 hands go up, so the rest of you count your blessings. SSSS, Secondary Selective Security Screening. You're never going to forget that acronym once you get it on your boarding pass, because what that means is you're going to get an extra pat down and an extra conversation before and after you board the plane. So the word had already reached the feds within hours of the lawsuit being filed. Where, you know, we go, we make our pilgrimage, we come back, and we're passing through the Middle East. We land in JFK, and nobody's getting off the plane. The plane has parked, nobody's leaving. And I look up ahead to see why nobody's leaving, and I see federal agents at the doors of the plane. And they're going around looking at everybody's passports. And I think to myself, I know exactly why they're here. And once they reach my sister, who was sitting in front of me, they see her last name, they look at her, they say, "Are you with anyone?" And I interrupt, I say, "Yeah, she's with me." And all of them, they look at each other as if like, "Yeah, we got our guy. Let's take him." So they take me, my mom, and my sister to an interrogation room, and it's all brown people in this interrogation waiting room. They had like one Greek guy in there. I felt so bad for him. I was like, this guy does not, get him. Poor guy, like,
We're all together.
yeah, right. Like, You know, right? Like, you know, in my mind, I'm like, yo, they want us brown folks. They don't want this guy. But you're right, poor all of us. See this internalized, like, you know. So they interrogate us for 4 hours. I get out. My dad stayed in New York because he had to work. And he picks us up. And he says, guess who called while you were away? I said, the NYPD? He says, no, the FBI. So the NYPD, the FBI were now collaborating to retaliate against the Muslim community with me as the target. And at that point, they started writing really nasty letters about me and my co-plaintiffs to the judge, which then the New York Post republished. And the New York Post republished them. And then that same week when I came back, I had knocks on my door, and I opened my door. And forgive my language, there was these two slobby-ass reporters, notepads in their hands, saying, you're the guy they're calling a terrorist, right? And I shut the door in their face. They were with the Post. And for the next couple of years, again, keep in your mind, I am a college sophomore. For the next couple of years, I had to deal with, you know, on the one side, harassment from police retaliation. On the other side, journalists and media amplifying every single thing that the cops were saying about me. And that's how I spent my undergrad.
Wow. I mean, first of all, I'm so sorry that was your experience.
Well, I'm here now, and we won, so we're, you know, there's a happy ending, of course, but the happy ending did not come without the hard stuff.
And I mean, what it makes me think of, I only have like 2 more questions, and we'll get to question and answer because I want to make sure we have enough time. But what you're describing makes me think there are all of these, when you're describing the retaliation, there are all of these incidents of, you know, aggressive or criminal behavior that are maybe done by institutions or done by powerful people that are not necessarily considered part of like the crime beat, or, you know, the crime beat, violence beat, that type of thing. A story that comes to mind is, you know, everything happening with Eric Adams and white collar crime, and that's often covered in a politics beat or a business beat if it's something that, you know, corruption that a business took part in. And so I just wanted to ask the 3 of you, as people who have developed this series, and of course also, as we've talked about, like storytelling and the ethics of the stories that you decide to tell and how you frame them, how we can reimagine what the crime beat looks like. Is it including more stories? Is it reimagining it as like a safety beat? Just like what did these experiences, personal and in creating this series, make you think about the idea of a crime beat, as I know some people in the audience are on a beat that looks like that?
Well, I'm going to say 2 things, and I'm going to try to keep it brief so we can get to Q&A. But the first thing is that, you know, you listen to Assad's story, and believe you're getting the very brief version of the story. It reminds me of when I was working on episode 6 of this show, and you know, we were looking at a court case that generated 10,000 pages of testimony about people's experiences with the NYPD in the 19th century. And at the end of it, it kind of snuck up on me. I'm getting old, so the emotions sneak up on you in a way because, you know, the testosterone's going down, you know, the whole shebang. So but I was reading this and I just started crying because it was this archive of experiences that I felt have been lost, but that are just important for us to understand. And I was like, and I kind of called Diana, left a voice message, and I was like, you know, I was upset, and I was like, yo, this stuff matters, man. Each piece of that, it was what happened in the airport, to Assad, to everybody, to the Greek guy.
Yeah, to the poor Greek guy.
It matters, right? This is people's lives. And so, you know, in some ways, there's a different tradition of journalism that's happening that's not the New York Post. I want to shout out people like Katie Honan. I want to shout out Bahar Ostadan, who WNYC just lost. Chris Sommerfeld. So many journalists, Matt Katz, who are documenting the daily horrors, really, but also just the daily facts, mundane facts of the NYPD every day. And I see Empire City as part of a kind of journalism ethics where they're documenting those daily facts, and that's valuable work. But then we also have to do this kind of journalism to recover that archive, right, of lost stories. So that's one thing, right? The other thing I want to say is that speaking about immigration, one point I'm going to make, we can come back to this more in the Q&A, but I just have to say, since we're currently living in a country which is wholly complicit in a genocide. The demographics unit that surveilled Assad was sort of started by a CIA agent. And when he gave an interview about what inspired him, he said, I was inspired by the way that Israel targeted Muslims after the Six-Day War in 1967. That was where he got the inspiration, because the question he was asking was, how do you surveil Muslims, right, communities which you don't understand, right? And he went to the people who he felt were the experts at that. So that's a fact. Yeah. May not like that fact, deal with the people who produced that fact, not us. Mm-hmm. Yeah. For journalists who are thinking about covering immigration, I recently saw a take that said, when you talk about immigration as a problem, a lot of journalists see that as kind of neutral, right? They're saying, well, hey, I'm not saying how we solve the problem. I'm just covering it as a problem. But when you cover immigration as a problem, you're already doing the work of fascism, right? Because now everything that comes into that has a certain kind of bent. You've already imported a whole bunch of assumptions into your journalism. And so I would say, you know, journalists may need to get out of the box of simply studying journalism and study some critical theory, critical theories of empire, critical theories of race, gender, class, and see how that unsettles some of the assumptions that have built journalism. And I'll leave it there.
I guess the only thing I'll add to that, yeah, thank you. Yeah. The only thing I'll add to that, I'm not a journalist or an expert. I was a subject of journalism. So I'll say, as a subject of journalism, I'll say, you know, don't go knocking on my door and say you're the guy they're calling the terrorist, right? Like maybe, you know, email me or something.
Basic, right?
Yeah.
You
know what I'm saying? I'm very
Don't do
accessible,
that.
right? I'm on Twitter, right? You know what I'm saying? Like there's a process.
Also
right?
that part.
Right, yeah, right? So that's all I'll say.
Yeah. Diane?
Well, I was just thinking about, you were talking about Lexal and all of these testimonies, and one of the testimonies actually comes from a journalist who wrote for many years, like the New York Post, positively about the police. He wrote this tome that like NYU should not have let me check out. It was like from 18 something or other. It's so old. It's like this big. And it's called The Police Protectors, and it was essentially this history, if you want to pretend it was that, but it was definitely like a propaganda book for the NYPD that this journalist created on the side as a way for them to raise money for their pensions. And it was like he was as tight as you could possibly be with the police. And he ends up at this committee testifying against the police. And I remember when we first learned that fact, because I'm sitting there and like on my desk for like 2 years was this giant book, and it's like, how did that guy end up there saying bad things about the police? And it's like, ultimately, like, it's one thing if it like doesn't impact your community, but in this instance the police ended up showing up at the workplace and like coming after people who worked with him, and wasn't he gonna get punched in the face?
Yeah, they jailed him.
They jailed him.
And beat him, yeah.
They beat him up, beat him to a pulp. So now you have him telling a very, very different story. And it was one thing when he was in like a protected class, but when he got in the way of people that they were trying to target, suddenly you're not so protected anymore.
Absolutely. I'm going to let everyone think about their questions. I have one final question, but we'll try to keep it brief, which is that obviously as a podcast, you're existing within the larger context of podcasts and what podcasts are popular. I have some stats on a page here that I'm not going to read, but true crime podcasts are incredibly popular. I think it's like 25% of podcast listeners listen to true crime, and they make up like the majority of the top 10 and that type of thing. So when you were making a podcast about crime and police, like how did you avoid falling into some of the tropes, or like how navigate being within this larger podcasting context? And as you answer these questions, I'm going to hand off the audience mic and we'll answer audience questions.
I'm just going to say quickly, I think that you can talk about crime, but journalists, if you really want to talk about what keeps people safe and have a real public safety beat, you need to talk about harm. Crime is a really interesting category, right, that does not necessarily guarantee that you're talking about harm, right? Because for most of this country's history, all kinds of things that people in this room needed to do to stay safe were crimes, In fact, almost all the rights that myself, Assad, and Diane, and Ryan have on the stage in here right now happened because people broke the law. So when you start with crime as a journalist, I think you've already imported some problems. And we need to talk about, when you start asking, where is harm being committed? Who's committing it? Who's committing harm on the most massive scale? Is it a person who hops a turnstile and doesn't pay a $2.90 fare? Or is it someone in Wall Street who is doing things that affect people all over the world? So that's my one piece. But I know Diane has some specific things about the ways that podcasting is implicated in this.
Yeah, how'd you move about this space ethically?
I get very mad. So, I mean, like, one of the things, I mean, the show came out on Wondery. They do true crime. Like, it's a thing. It's like people want to, like, position our show like a true crime show. And we're like, that's not really what, like, we were doing. And that's a thing that you have to navigate. And one of the main things that I've been, like, on a soapbox about was Barstool Sports. This is a very specific example, but I was very upset about it a couple of years ago. They decided to get into true crime narrative podcasting. I don't know if this was a one and done, but I hope it was. And their podcast on the, like, little key art, it was sponsored by Taser. And then in their social media, they had, like, all the little journalists playing with tasers in the office that they had gotten from Taser to, you know, support Taser, true crime.
We're gonna recirculate that clip and make it go viral
I mean, like,
again.
I got so poor Chandra to hear all about this. I was so riled up about this. And I'm like, why is no one paying attention to the nonfiction, like, this true crime show being, like, made by Taser? This is, like, it was just, to me, like, represented, like, the apex of, like, all the things that were wrong, and, like, and no one was looking at it. And it's not alone. There's a lot of more subtle things. And one of the things, at least I see in podcasting that I've worked on that's, like, adjacent in similar spaces, is the ads, which is also really interesting. It's like, oh, you're making a podcast about true crime. Let's put in all these ads about alarm systems and things that are about safety, because they think, like, oh, we're going to capitalize on the fear that you are going to create so that people will want to come and buy our product. And it's been really interesting having those conversations on shows of, like, we don't really want, that's, like, exact opposite of the point of this show. But there are other shows out there that absolutely lean into that. That's how you can get money. It's how they make money, et cetera. So there's also just the ethics, of course, of, like, how you tell the story and to what extent you're thinking about, like, the people. And, you know, like, Beyond Repair, like, Beyond All Repair, like, had done a really lovely job this year. But, like, a lot of true crime stories, I mean, they do the worst by the people at the center, and they're not normally thinking about, like, what's good for the humans, and it's like, what do you need for the dramatic arc? And, you know, after the fact, we hear about, like, all sorts of stuff that make us uncomfortable. And so there's a lot of choices you can make editorially, but also on the business side, like, we're really being pushed in a certain direction. And I think you can't talk about true crime without recognizing, like, that's what people want to fund, and that's what people want to put ads in. And we can all get Taser to sponsor podcasts if you really want to, but please don't.
Yeah,
so, like,
yeah.
That's what we're sort of up against right now.
And yo, by the way, shout out for Diane Hodson. Give her a hand. Yo, let me tell you, anybody, yo, when I talk about underrated in the game, like, yo, while we were producing, like, Empire City, Diane released a show which went to, like, number 2 or 3 on the Apple charts. We got millions of podcasts.
One,
Man,
but
number
that's
one.
okay.
Just on the low. Just like, oh, by the way, I already have a joint on it. So just really talented. But just to circle back, I just want to say that 2 quick things, which is, like, Mary Rogers murder, speaking of true crime, right? Never solved. All that hype, all that business, right? Thinking about the connection between that and Wondery, but the crime never even got solved, right? That's number 1. Number 2, another point I want to make is that talk about the streams of history coming together. Remember when I told y'all New Yorkers never wanted police? Remember I told you there's a prison that is a Revolutionary War prison? I want everybody to go see this prison. Assad and I went to go see the prison because, and you know where we saw that prison? It's at One Police Plaza. One Police Plaza was built on top of a place where the British incarcerated Americans. And Assad and we were there because that was where Assad had announced his lawsuit. So I just wanted to mention that.
I mean, that's a striking image to land on, and I feel like it's a great place to start for questions about ethics, about public space, about communities. Like, it brings together a lot of the themes that we've been talking about all evening, and so just wanted to open up to questions. Okay, Chandra is gonna run for a second, but we can start with questions.
There's probably some good Assad questions.
Hello. So my question is, I think, I'll speak louder. I thought that the podcast was really brilliant, and the biggest compliment I can give you is, it was very cinematic.
Yeah.
Like, I could feel myself at the rally outside where they were being arrested. I could feel myself back in 18-something where the black woman was kidnapped. So incredibly, closer. But I have a very specific question, and I kind of accosted Chenjerai in the elevator. It was very funny too, the podcast. You know, when you talked about at one point Mayor Adams foaming at the mouth. I mean, that's hilarious. You talked about Police Commissioner Kinney getting stole. Really funny. So is this an act? This project, and I talked to Chenjerai, and he said he would answer this in front of the audience. Is this journalism? Is this history? Is this subjective? Like, what frame should we be listening, and particularly in not only for what you guys cover, but how it impacts other historical subjects? Because there were so many things that you guys talked about that I wanted to know more about, like Seneca Village. I wanted to know more. You know, New York has this impression in terms of how you think about New York and the slave trade, and you know, we kind of wear this badge of honor. But I think that you guys talked about that very differently. So it made me want to go and do some other research and other historical things. So what lens should we be listening to this through?
It is. You know, on the question of objectivity, I know that a lot of people are skeptical of objectivity because so much violence has been done in the name of objectivity. But I believe in objectivity because I believe that when we're talking about a genocide, when we're talking about reproductive rights, when we're talking about sexual assault, when we're talking about police brutality and police killing, those things are objective facts. Those are not people's opinions. And so if you have to deal in a world of objectivity to sort of assert that those things are facts and find out the truth about them. Empire City, I say that to say Empire City, I think, is an objective history of the police. Right? Everything we're talking about is something that we found some kind of empirical evidence for. And if someone wants to debate that, history is always a conversation about facts that evolve. Sometimes you get a new empirical evidence and you have to change the fact. But Empire City is an objective history in that regard. What I will say, what you might feel that's different about Empire City stems from the fact that the dominant story about the police, one that is still being told in newspapers, is a bullshit lie, right? And as journalists, we have a responsibility to platform the smartest versions of history, of any story, not just history, right now. We don't platform the stupid version and put resources and time into that. You start with the version that has facts behind it. Unfortunately, that's not how American history has worked. What has been already platformed is the dumb version. So what we did was we started with the smart version. We started with the historically informed version. And then, from that basis, we challenged our own assumptions. We learned. We realized we were wrong about things. We reshaped and refashioned our understanding of how the police evolved. But we just started, we started from a smarter perspective. And so, yeah, I mean, that's my answer to that. But any other questions?
Yeah, that was good. I'll support it. I know we don't have it.
I think I wanted to add to that. Congratulations on this amazing series. But Diane, you brought up episode 6 a moment ago, the corruption episode. And the big revelation I had listening to that one was just how hard or impossible it is for journalists to cover the police. You were talking about corruption, about how there hasn't been a moment of corruption, you know, in New York City police history, Chandra. I remember that conversation where it's like, at the end you have to see it's constant. And journalists by design is covering these stories beat by beat. So I really kind of came away that you can't do it. You're almost too much at a disadvantage to cover this story, which is constant. I mean, Assad, with your story, I mean, you just told us this happened in 2013. This is a decade of police incompetence and malice of like surveilling Muslims in this city. Not just the malice, but incompetence. And so, you know, it's again, it's not a new beat. It's something that's, you know, we could have these journalist entries in the papers, and we have, but it's not working. And did you think about that when you were, because that felt like a really revelation moment in episode 6.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you got it. You got it.
Well, the corrupt one, like the corruption at the end, like one of my favorite lines of Chandra in the series is in the course of an interview with Leslie, who was a former prosecutor at the Mullen Commission.
Leslie Kornfeld, yeah.
Yeah, Leslie Kornfeld. And she and Chandra are talking, and like in a lot of ways as a person, she like she was prosecuting the police, so in so many ways it felt like he should be talking to someone that like understands and is sort of like in it with him and talking about what's going on. And she uses the language of corruption, and Chandra stops her and says, but if we say something's corrupt, it means at some point it wasn't corrupt. And at this point in our work, like too long in, we can't find that. And like that was something like that I think in terms of assumptions, when Chandra was talking about language before, we default to language that's used and reused, but when you really do this work, like you just, it's pretty damning, and you can't really come out of it feeling like, oh, to use the word corruption now whenever I see it, I'm like, that just feels wrong.
Yeah, I mean, that's a perfect example how typically if you challenge the word corruption, people just kind of roll their eyes like, oh, you're being biased, you're being leftist. And I'm like, no, this is the analytical, empirical fact of it. Show me the, like, I'm going to go into the weeds, I'm sorry. In the 1842 document that the city council used, right, yes, used.
This is what we told him he couldn't include.
This is what I'm going to be. They said, when they were arguing for the modern NYPD, right, what they say in that document is they're already saying the police are like completely, have a terrible incentive structure. They say if they stop crime, they remove bread from their mouth. That's a quote of what they were saying about the police in 1842. So you show me the point when they were not corrupt, right? I mean when they were not, when they worked. Excuse me, is a better thing to say. So yeah. Anyway.
Also, if I can grab really quickly, I thought your point about access issues is a really salient one. In the podcast, Chandra describes going to the police museum to try to get information about the history of the police and how they were basically impenetrable and like wouldn't provide you information. And so I think that's a really good point that's very well made, is that journalists who are covering the police and the NYPD oftentimes do face these institutional barriers to getting access to materials, to getting access to interviews, to getting access to content beyond press releases. And I think that, you know, is something that people who are building out these beats and able to be on these beats more permanently and for many years are being able to kind of push back against and learn from each other. But I think it's a really good point about the struggles of reporting on this beat and something that you encountered even in your work producing this series.
Oh, by the way, also, that was Ben Walker. You want to talk about dope archival work? Check out Theory of Everything, Not All Propaganda is Art. And we also borrowed some sonic techniques from Ben as well. So big shout out to Ben. You know, check it out, y'all. I'm telling you, it'll blow your mind. Question? Other
Hi.
questions?
I just want to reinforce something quickly that you've brought up a couple of times now. In Humo, Murder and Silence in El Salvador, journalist David Alvarenga actually shares that the authoritarian government of El Salvador uses Israeli companies' spyware to surveil journalists and other political undesirables in El Salvador. So just to reinforce that, like, everything that's happening is connected, and we just need to be calling it out like you're doing. So thank you. But my actual question is around the Capitol angle in terms of like how and when the police really transformed into protecting wealth. I was listening to Scene on Radio's season 7 about capitalism, and they were talking about, you know, when police got involved in union busting and all of that. So I was wondering if you're going to get more into that throughout the season. I know you brought up bits and pieces of how the police are connected to Capitol, such as slave patrols and all of that, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to offer too many spoilers, but I will say that one of the key interventions that I think we sort of wanted to put like this, especially dealing with Todd's question, one of the key hypotheses that we went into this history with was that problems with the police around race and other things are not just about bigotry, right? Because what I noticed is that at a lot of, you know, during so many protests about the police over the last decade, it would get reduced down to like, yeah, the police are racist, right? Which is like, you know, facts, right? But I also noticed that the police actually really love that narrative. They're like, oh yeah, we're racist, right? What about all the black and brown police, right? And then they would parade a black and brown police chief out, right? So they could dispense with that narrative and that narrative of everything boiling down to them just being racist actually gave them tremendous tools to push back. So we wanted to go deeper and say, you know, what this was, and we did see that, you know, to your point, and you'll see throughout the series that what it gets defined as danger, and the media, James Gordon Bennett plays a key role in initiating this, right, is about what's dangerous to Capitol, what's dangerous to, and even Eric Adams, right? There's a quote where Eric Adams says, former cop mayor Eric Adams says, look, a lot of our priorities are about making the city safe for business. Right, I mean, he's really clear about it. Like, it's not necessarily, got to make it safe for business. And he says, you know, it's not even about necessarily what's totally making it safe. He said the city could actually be safe, but if people don't feel like it's safe for business, then we got to police to make it safe.
There's a really interesting study from the Pew Research Center that came out in August that was about local media coverage of crime and violence. And I thought a really interesting point about it was that though property crime is actually more prevalent, I believe, more prevalent or like equally prevalent to like violent crime is covered at or it appears in local news coverage at a significantly higher rate, which serves to kind of create an environment in which people are fearful of violent crime. But I thought what's kind of interesting about this in relation to the conversation we're having is while people are experiencing maybe crime to their property, it's being conveyed to audiences as like physical violence being done unto individuals. And so that's an interesting connection and shows just how we report about crime and different types of crime also affects these narratives of the police that become codified and become what's accepted.
Yeah, there's the same. I mean, I don't know, Assad, I wonder if you've seen that. I remember, the way they talk about, property damage. I remember the protesters saying, imagine me shedding a tear over a broken Walmart window. They equate it, right, to like people being harmed, right, and there's more outrage. Or like the way the term violence is applied to property damage, right? Sometimes the violent is the actual institution that got damaged, was with the one committing violence. But anyway, cool, all right. Yeah.
I have a question about narrative and language as well as the corruption angle. As you said, the power of the show is that it can give us facts about the history of the NYPD. And I'm still thinking about something that you said, I think it was in episode 2, about how, especially now, when we listen to a history like this, it can be easy to say, oh, look, the police is working as designed, as it was designed to be. And you said something really interesting in that episode where you were like, yes, but like you wanted to push back on that narrative of like, but there's more that we can do. When we say it's by design, it almost creates a kind of fatalism as if it can't be changed. And I just wanted, if anyone could speak a little bit more to sort of the operating principle behind that idea.
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously these tremendous lines of continuity, but I was saying that actually getting into the weeds, I hope this isn't too theoretical to say, sometimes when we do that, we complete power. This is a term I believe I learned from Foucault, right? Which is like, power still has to make itself, right? So even though the police have these economic incentives, right? They do have racism built in, right? All these things, patriarchy. But, as Ben was saying, the police were kind of also sloppy and incompetent. They still had to figure it out. And as they were figuring it out, people were resisting every step of the way, right? Even the police were resisting. Police didn't even want to be in uniforms. Police protested at the police chief's house when he put them in uniforms. So I think when we say everything's working in design, we're ignoring stories like Assad's, where someone pushed back and carved out a victory. We're not, and also, I actually think it's a more powerful indictment of the police. Not to say that they're working as they were designed back in 1845, but to say there were all these moments where they had an opportunity in that history to go a different direction, where people pointed it out, where people protested, where they could have formed in a better way. And instead, they developed in the wrong way, in a way becoming worse. Each stage of reform making them something more monstrous until you get to where we are right now. A police department which cannot be held accountable by anybody. The most recent police commissioner had to step down a couple of weeks after he got appointed. The CCRB, multiple CCRB, the institution supposed to hold them accountable, essentially forced to resign by the former cop mayor. This is the state we're in after this history. But that was a result of all these moments of innovation and a struggle. So I think it is important not to just simply say it was by design. Can I add to that? Of course.
Yeah. So it's a great question. I understand the appeal of it too. It's often said in response to those who say the system is broken and that we can be reformed and so on. But just to piggyback off Chenjerai, I'll give the example for my case. So my case was called Raza versus City of New York. Raza was the name of one of my co-plaintiffs. And our case was actually building upon a previous case called Hanshu versus Special Services Division. Barbara Hanshu was a very is, because she's still around, is a very well-known left-wing activist who was active in the 70s with groups like the Panthers and so on. And she was surveilled, and she sued, for being spied on for her political activities. Her lawsuit lasted like 12 years. And eventually what emerged from that came to be known as the Hanshu Guidelines. The way the Hanshu Guidelines worked is that they set restrictions on how the NYPD should be allowed to conduct surveillance. After 9/11, those guidelines were basically relaxed. And so what we wanted to do with our Raza lawsuit was not only did we want to reinstate those guidelines, but also to strengthen them with additional safeguards because we felt that they weren't enough. And so I vividly recall one of these days I was going to court in April 2016. It was one of my last court appearances for the lawsuit. I'm walking to the court, and I go there, and we're all, everyone's going to testify from the Muslim community and our allies. And the first person I see is Barbara Hanshu, who showed up to our case 50 years after hers. Wow. She was a lawyer. It gets even crazier. It was the same judge from her case. Yeah. I'm telling you, there's got to be a movie one day. This guy's name is Judge Charles Haidt. He's 93 years old. I think he's retired now. He also presided over the case of Mutulu Shakur.
Yes.
So he heard our testimony, and we're all going up testifying, and I'm the last one to testify, college senior, going up there, and you can get a transcript of our testimonies, and the judge wants us all to be quick, and I'm like, Judge, don't worry, I got class in 40 minutes, I will be quick. I make my testimony. A couple months later, my lawyer calls me, and he says, Assad, I have good news. I said, what's the good news? He says, the judge was actually not satisfied with our policy demands because he wanted us to make stronger demands against the police. That almost never happened.
Did y'all
right?
hear that? The judge!
Yeah. I guess he was tired of dealing with this for 50 years. I don't know. But he wanted us to make stronger demands. He said, in his own words, he said, these demands do not do enough to burnish protections for the plaintiffs. And so we all went back to the drawing board, and we said, let's make stronger demands as a community. And we present them to the judge. And eventually the judge agrees on those demands. And now the next step is just to get him to sign off on those demands. But all this is to say is that I think that phrase kind of erases the agency of the people who are impacted and the work that we do to bring more accountability. I'm not saying the lawsuit was the be-all, end-all. There's still, as you all see, every single day, a lot more work to be done. But I agree. I'll out myself. I'll say I'm a historical materialist. I don't adopt fatalistic views of politics. I really do think that politics is very much a material struggle, and that's something that involves concrete and conscious action every single day.
I'd also say that it also gives credit to this idea that there's like a wizard behind the curtain that like figured it all out. Like they did not, and they were like from day one it's like, oh, this doesn't work. And so like when we were crafting the show, it was like a bunch of, well, this didn't work either, and each episode was sort of looking at an aspect of reform. Like most of the things that we trace of what happened are things people pushed for,
Recording stuff.
oh, thinking it would make it better, but it didn't. And so like, but we wanted to trace that, like there was a sense of possibility, like, well, maybe this could be it, and maybe this could be it, because nobody really knew. Like there was never a time where someone's like, this is what it should look like.
All right, we have two more people with mics, and then I think we're gonna have to cut off questioning just for the sake of time, and also because we're running a little close to 8, we'll want to be somewhat brief in our last two answers, but thank you so much, I mean, for your incredibly thoughtful answers up to this point. I think it starts with you, and then we'll end with you.
Well, my question is sort of as a fellow podcaster and a writer, I honestly get heart palpitations just thinking about the massive material you're dealing with. And so I was wondering, especially Chen and I like going in the weeds. So I'm just wondering, how did you decide, where to actually go with the story? And like specifically, like did you have a guiding question like glued to your computer? Did you have like a set of rules? Like how did you approach that?
I wish, I want to answer briefly, so I'll just say that, I hate to, I'm not going to actually cite that person. Here's what I'm going to say. One of the most important technologies in podcasting and in this kind of narrative journalism is revision. You don't figure it out at once. As Diane was saying, I got heart palpitations because, again, in Empire City, you are hearing in a way like the simplest possible version of this history. And there was all these moments where we would have these drafts. These stories get much longer before they get shorter and they get tighter. And it's really a collaborative process, right? And the work of incredible editors like Diane and Sarah and so many of the people, the folks, and our students, here in the program. That's one of the great things about, NYU journalism is we have time to sit around and do this, because I would come to the table, y'all see, this is unedited, unscripted Chenjerai. You know what I mean? Can you imagine if I didn't have edited, every episode would be 3 hours. I'm like, oh, I'm in the weeds of the document. And, like, the editors would say, look, this is the key theme. This is the character we can latch on to. And we would go over it over and over again and say, I think we can take this part out. This isn't necessary. We've done this work here. And that only happens through revision. It happens when you take time. And one of the things I hope for our industry and for the people who are making this is that we can protect that time that people need for this kind of documentary work. Some of these TV shows, some of which are slamming and good, like The Penguin, but some which are not good, got like $100 million budgets. And the most talented people, some of the most talented people doing this work right now don't have a job, or the reward for all the work making award-winning podcasts, and more important than awards, podcasts that change policy, transform people, engage people, their reward for that is to be laid off by these companies. So, but you need to make time for that revision and that work, and essentially that's my answer.
And I'll just add very briefly, and part of it is also just not trying to remove ego as much as possible. For Chenjerai, like this story was obviously very important, and this was a really long build to this moment, and so it's very easy to be so precious about every piece. And I think like it was a real credit to Chenjerai to be like that city council thing, like it was hard, but like there was a sense that like if you can create an environment on a team where like understanding and respecting that everybody is trying to do best by the story, and that like we're making choices, and you know what, you can take something out and you can put it right back, you can be a lot less precious. And so like we did have like guiding questions, we did have like things mapped out in a Miro, we revisited things at different points and like brainstormed, and we had a lot of different ways in which we intervened in the process to get where we went. But like none of that would have been effective if you don't have a host who's like, I actually don't know everything, and I'm here to like figure it out with the people around me. And I've worked with people that aren't like that, and the best people I work with are, because that means like it's like an actual journey that you're going through versus one that you're just like crafting for the purposes of a podcast. And when you have to create an artificial journey, the listeners feel it, they hear it. So I think like when we can make it as real as possible, it translates.
I just gonna say I'm gonna be brief. I know, sorry, but the lessons we have to learn about editing are also lessons we have to learn in our movements, which is like, how do you have passionate disagreements but still kind of keep your eye on the prize, right? I mean, the great thing about the team I hired was they were not intimidated by whatever aura Chenjerai had. You know, I would lay stuff down and be like, well, as a PhD in critical so-and-so, I think we should do this, and I'd be like, I think that's boring. I'm like, damn, she really just came at me like that? Like, I know what I'm doing. I got, you know what I mean? Like, but that's who you gotta push back. You gotta fight it out. So anyway, yeah. And you gotta fight it out in our politics.
Okay, I think you're the last question. This is on. So in the Rotten Orchard episode, you go and talk to the wife of the chief of police who's like running the museum. And
the second part is in some ways more important. But
yeah,
but go ahead.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
And she just goes, "There's no corruption. Like, what are you talking about?" And like my when I heard that, I was like, no one has ever media trained you? Like, my jaw hit the floor. Like, I had to remove
She had been media trained. It's horrifying, but yeah.
So for you, what was that interview like? I'm like, that must have been like, was it like, oh my God, was it like you're trying to understand her? Like what, like, tell me about that interview. Like, I'm just so curious how that went down, and what you felt, like how you felt the story was playing into what she was telling you. Like her, yeah.
I have to tell you the real story over a drink.
Yeah, please.
It was a fascinating thing to even be invited, but I would say, you know, a lot of it was, I had a genuine, I mean, listen, Carol, I had a sense of what the police museum was by this time. I had heard some things. Most of these police museums are public relations exercises for police, right? And all over the country, not just New York. Also, it's true that, you know, Carol's partner was, you know, the kind of police commissioner that I would define as pretty wicked. You know, the stuff, he called Eric Garner and Mike Brown thugs and called the people that killed them heroes pretty dismissively. But I had to approach Carol with a genuine curiosity. You know, as a journalist, I had to be open. I had to open myself to her and say, like, look, like, we share an interest in history at some level. And, you know, the only thing I could do that I think is why Carol invited me to her home is because I was not lying when I said, I want to hear where you're coming from. I said, I want to genuinely hear where you're coming from, and I will report what you said, the way you said it. I'm not gonna do it deceptively. We do some editing in the show, but what she said and what you hear reflects what she believes. And I think that's important for journalists to know. Like, even when, you know, it's clear I have a different take on it, that was what that was ethically the right thing to do, and it was also like the only way I could get that access to hear where she comes from. And, you know, Carol believes, right, her viewpoint was, I think she thought it was a slick talking point. Like, what she's, the really generous take on what she's saying is like, police who do these things are criminals, and we don't feature criminals.
Unless it's Al Capone's gun.
And well, there's that part. But I think there's lessons here, because I think that, like, you know, some people might think that the way to go at someone like that is just to call them out, shout them down, not even talk to them, don't platform them. And I'm like, well, but you never get inside how power really functions and rationalizes itself if you don't actually show, oddly, I mean, I don't think compassion is the right word, but at least curiosity.
And I just want to add one tiny thing to that, which is like you said your feelings in the room. Like, you didn't own like everything, but I think it's really important if you're gonna like hang someone out to dry a bit, like even though she would stand by all the things she said, I think if you're going to disagree with someone in the writing, you should have like it's your responsibility as a host, as a journalist, as a producer, to disagree in the room. So like you gave her a chance to say the things. It's not like we came after her. She said it. She knew the context. She knew what you were bringing up. And I think that was also really why it hits the way it does.
Well, thank you all. Can I grab this from you? Thank you all so much for being here. I think that's a great note to end on. I mean, it's a question of just like ethically engaging with sources and whose stories you feature in what you decide to publish. And so for this event, I feel like it's a great place to end. Thank you to Chenjerai, Asad, and Diane for being here. Thank you to the Podcasting and Audio Reportage program at NYU, which Chenjerai and Sarah are faculty.
Ethics and Journalism Initiative.
Thank you. Thank you to the NYU events team. A couple of shout outs. Listen to Empire City wherever you get your podcasts. Write a review, give it 5 stars. A couple other shout outs. On October 29th, the Ethics and Journalism Initiative is hosting another event right here. It's a lunchtime event, 12 to 2 if you can make it, on ethics and immigration reporting, covering some of the same questions we covered, especially in the second half of this event. We'll have the founder of Documented. We'll have immigration reporters from ProPublica, The City, and The New Yorker. Yeah. So please join us and be there. Like I said, it's here, October 29th. It's on our website, ethicsandjournalism.com. And yeah, Asad, pop in.
I am developing a walking tour that's draws directly from the podcast series. So the goal is to bring to life what you hear in these 8 episodes in the streets of New York. I'd love to have you all join the tour. Just follow New York Narratives on Instagram. My handle is Asad from NYC, ASAD from NYC, and I look forward to walking with you in the streets of New York.
Absolutely. Thank you, Asad.